All right, hello. So in this quick video, I want to sort of give a brief explanation about how to understand file paths and URLs when web programming. So in this case, a file path is going to be the way that we tell a computer, the way the computer knows how to find individual files. It's the path, the directions it needs to take to get to those files. This is particularly relevant when you want to do things like include style sheets or images, right? How do we tell the computer where to find that style sheet or where to find that image? How do we connect these things together? It's also going to be useful for when we want to look at the URLs of a web page we're looking at to try to figure out where files might exist or sort of understanding what page we're looking at all. So let's go ahead, we'll get to it. Okay, so the first thing I want to note, sort of will drive a lot of this together, is hopefully you recall that when we're loading a web page, right? We do this by putting in a URL into our browser, right? And that sends a request that then loads in a particular page, a particular set of files that we've written that will then get sent back to our browser for our browser to render. Now, when we're looking at a URL, right, when you put something in, so you're going to go view your page that you've published to GitHub, or if you're going to go look at any web page at all in the world, those web pages have a particular format, right? So the URL here is going to generally start with like HTTP or HTTPS. The S stands for secure, so a secure connection. That's usually the one you want. They'll then have what's called the host, and they'll then have what's called the path. And the path is the part that we're going to be really talking about today, and it's of most interest. So this is an example of a URL. Now, URLs have a very particular format. This is a really simple URL, but they actually get a lot more complex. You could look at the one even at the top of my browser here that's showing my slides, and even that has a slightly more complex URL with a little bit more to it. So let's talk a little bit what this URL format looks like. So just like a postal address, or just like if you're sending a letter to somebody, there's a particular format you have to follow when specifying a URL. When you're writing a letter, right, you're putting in someone's address, you put their name, then their street, then their city, then their zip, right? That's things in order, and there's sort of a structure you have to go with. You can tweak it a little bit because humans read the post office, but you can't tweak your URLs because computers aren't that intelligent. So what we're going to do is the URLs are going to follow a very particular format. They're going to start with what I said was called the scheme, or schema, or the protocol, and that's what the P actually stands for in HTTPS, right? It's the protocol, the way in which we're going about doing something, right? What is the protocol for doing this? And that's going to basically say how we're going to access the information on this page. Generally, this is going to be HTTPS. It might be HTTP if it's a non-secure site. Other things you'll see show up in the web is you might see things like, you might hear things called FTP, which is the File Transfer Protocol. That's another way of referring to effectively a location, a resource, a set of information on the web, and accessing in a particular way. You might think if you're working with GitHub, you might see some of the things using an SSH protocol, which is a secure shell protocol. It's another way of accessing things. There's a whole bunch of these different protocols that are basically letting you communicate over networks. But when we're dealing with web pages, we're generally looking at HTTP or HTTPS. All right, // you're all familiar for that. Then we're going to have the domain, which is basically the website we're viewing at, right? Domain.com, slides.com for this one. It could be ischool.uw.edu, right? It might have multiple dots in it, but it's basically everything that goes up to the .com, .org, .edu, .whatever at the end. That's sort of what we think of as the website, right? That's the domain, that's the server. That's basically this tells us what server to go to find the web page that we want to see. This will be followed by a colon, then a port. We don't talk about port. We don't use port too much in this class or at all when doing web programming. You're then going to have the path, which is basically going to say which page on that server we want to access to. So this says basically which web server on the internet somewhere, right? What other computer am I going to go access? And then the path says which folder and which file on that server am I going to then get the HTML file from, right? So imagine like here's literally you're jumping into a computer that's on the internet somewhere, and you're going to go rifle through its files. The path tells us which file we want to get to. We'll talk about how to read this in a second. There's then a query, which we work with a little bit when we're doing API requests. We're not going to handle that in this class. And then I will note that at the very end, you can put after a hash code symbol, or hashtag symbol, or pound symbol, I guess they used to call it, you can put then what's called a fragment, which basically says what part of that page you want to be able to access, right? Where do I want to go in that page? So not only am I looking at this HTML file, but the fragment might say, I'm also actually, in particular, looking at a particular part, a particular section of that HTML file. And we'll talk about how to do that in a second. Okay, so let's talk about what this path looks like, right? So this path in this example is going to example/page. If we look at the URL up here at the top of my browser, you can see that the path that it is indicating is so again, we're going to go to the slides.com. That's my domain. And then everything after that, up until this hash symbol, is going to be the path, right? So the path for this one is Joel Ross, LIS 549 file path / live. And that's the particular page that we're then looking at to be able to view. There's some other stuff going on here at the URL, but that's the basic idea. So what does it mean to have all these slashes, right? Why is it example /page? Well, when we're thinking about where to find, because again, what we're doing is we're saying, where am I going to find this file on a computer? Well, when we're looking at files on a computer, files on computers are structured into folders, right? And those folders go inside of other folders, and those folders go inside of other folders, and those folders go inside of other folders. And that's how your whole computer is structured. This produces what is called a directory tree. This is a computer science term for a data structure. It's called a tree, where you basically have something at the top, and it sort of expands out as it goes. And it's called a tree because it kind of vaguely looks like a Christmas tree if you sort of view it together, or, you know, any other kind of tree-like structure, I guess. So generally, when you're looking at your folder structure, you're going to end up having a tree, right? So I can do this if I open up Finder. I can see this exact kind of tree showing up on my computer, right? So I could have, I could go to my hard drive, right, my Macintosh HD hard drive, and then I can have a users folder. And inside that users folder, I then have a class that's my user. And then inside my user, I then have my desktop. And inside my desktop, I then have my exercise 1. And inside my exercise 1, I have my CSS folder, right? So I have this folder inside of a folder, inside of a folder, inside of a folder, inside of a folder. Now, in the end, this users folder is inside my hard drive, right? There's nothing, we can't go beyond that. Right? Eventually, we get to what's called to the top, right? Or to the bottom, as depending on your point of view, right? We get to sort of the end where there is no parent, right? There's no folder this other thing is inside. So that's what's referred to as the root directory, right? That's going to be the root of my tree. It's where my tree starts. If you imagine my tree, if you imagine this is a tree that grows down, right? Maybe it's like a hanging vine kind of thing. This is the root, says this is where I'm starting my computer, right? That's the root, the base of my computer, and then we keep adding folders, we keep building our tree going out from that. Some other terms that come out of this data structure, we will talk about things like these are branches, right? A little bit. You can talk about leaves. There's a whole metaphor that goes on with tree data structures. The language that we'll often use is we'll talk about the parent directory or the parent folder. So, for example, this in this example, this documents folder is inside of the mic-free user folder, right? So it's going to be inside. So it's this document folder's parent, right? The thing that is inside is the mic-free folder. Similarly, the mic-free folder is said to have a child folder, right? A folder that's inside of it, documents. Mic-free also has a desktop folder, another child. The desktop and documents folders are said to be siblings because they are inside the same parent directory. So we very much are going to think about an ancestry kind of tree going on here, right? Where we talk about sort of that this is the parent, the grandparent, the great-grandparent, right? And then that parent has children, and then that children has other children, and those children then have parents. We can use that to sort of talk about how we refer to one folder or another. So we could talk about that the Project 1 folder's parent is documents, and the Project 1 folder's grandparent is mic-free. And again, we can see that in sort of my actual real-world system here, where my CSS folder's parent is the exercise 1 Joel Ross folder, and that folder's parent is the desktop, right? This exercise 1 folder is inside the desktop. So that's the language we use to then describe that structure. Okay, so the way that we then write down where files might be, what folders are inside of other folders, is by using this particular syntax with these slashes that we've sort of been seeing all throughout these URLs. So the way that we write a path to a file is we're going to start by writing the name of one folder, followed by a slash, followed by the next folder that's in the folder that's inside of it, followed by a slash, followed by the folder inside of that, followed by a slash, followed by a folder that's inside that. So we use slashes to indicate that we're talking about a folder that's inside of another. If I go pull up my computer here, you'll notice that I have my computer set up so that it shows me where the folder that I'm currently selected exists. So it says that this is the exercise 1 JROS folder. It's got a little caret here. It's inside the desktop. That's inside class. It's inside users. It's inside my hard drive. So the way that we write this down in computer code is we're going to, instead of putting the little caret here to say, we're sort of saying that the class is inside of users, we're going to put a slash. The slash means folder inside of another, or thing inside of another folder. So for example, this would say that this exercise 01 Joel Ross folder is inside desktop, is inside class, is inside users. If we're writing this down, wait for a second. All right, so if we were writing this down, we might say that we've got my exercise 01 Joel W. Ross folder. Come on, try to spell correctly. That folder is inside of desktop, right? So we write desktop / exercise 01. The slash means this thing is inside of that thing, right? It's inside the thing before it. Desktop is inside of the class folder. Class folder is inside of the users folder, and my users folder is inside of my computer, right? So my users folder is at what's called the root, and we write the root of my computer as just a single slash with nothing before it. So if we start with a slash, that says this is the root of my computer, and I think you even have a little note. That leading slash says that's the root. So for example, this example, right, this is sort of just a syntax piece, would say start in the root directory of my computer, go into a folder called absolute. Inside there, then go into a folder called path, then go in a folder called to, then go into a folder called file, and that's where you find your file as well. All right, so this says start at my root, go into my users folder, go into my class folder, go into my desktop folder, go into my exercise 01 JW Ross folder, and that's where I'll find whatever I'm looking for, right? That's where this thing is. If we were adding in more files, so for example, from there, I might say, okay, from there, go into the CSS folder, and then from there, go into the go to the style.css file, and that is now the path, the directions to get to this style.css file, right? That tells the computer how I can get here, and the computer does that by saying, great, start at the root, right? We got this opening slash at the beginning, that means start at root. From there, go into users, and then class, then desktop, then exercise 01 Joel W. Ross, then CSS, then style.css. That's where we are. Okay, so that's an example of a file path, and that's how we will read file paths. So what happens in URLs then is this is sort of, it's not exactly doing this, but the way that the URL could kind of be viewed is this is saying, go from the slides.com computer, right? Here's my slash, that's saying starting from whatever the root of this like available computer is, go into the Joel Ross folder, then go into the LIS 549 file paths folder, and then go find the live file inside of there. That's kind of what that URL is saying, though there's some other stuff going on here about how we're using URLs to make this particular web page work. Okay, cool. Okay, great. So this is an example of what's called an absolute path. It's called an absolute path because this is giving me directions, right? This is my map. This tells me how to get to my style.css file, and it tells me how to do that from anywhere in the world, right? It doesn't, well, anywhere on the computer, right? It doesn't matter where I'm starting. That from there, it says, great, like no matter where you are, no matter which folder I currently have open, right? No matter if I'm looking at my desktop, if I'm looking at my pictures, if I'm looking at, it doesn't matter what folder I'm currently looking at, right? I can be down here looking at my music folder, which doesn't have anything in it, but it says, great, if I want to get to the style.css file, this gives me directions. It says, great, first thing you do, go back to the root, right? First, you go back to start. Okay, great, I go back to start. Cool, now I'm at start. From start, I go to users. From users, I go to class. From class, I go to desktop. From desktop, I go to exercise 01. From that, I go to CSS, and there's my file that I'm looking for. So the absolute path tells me how to get to there from anywhere you want on your computer. The other way that we write file paths, and in fact, the better and more common way we do that, is using what is called a relative path. A relative path gives us directions to a particular file or to a particular folder from wherever we happen to currently be. So for example, if I was in the desktop, then the directions from the desktop doesn't need to be go all the way back to start. I don't need to pop all the way back to the root of my computer. I can just be like, hey, I'm in the desktop. I can get to the file I want to go in 2 steps, right? I could just say go from my desktop to exercise 01 Joel W. Ross. From there, go to CSS. From there, I'll go to style.css. So again, the way we would write that is we'd say, okay, so starting from where I am, so this is going to be, we'll write this as a comment. So this is going to be starting from desktop. We would say, I don't need to say start the root, so I'm not going to put a beginning slash. There's no slash at the start. I'm just going to say from my desktop, go into the exercise 01.joelross folder because it's right there. It's staring at us, right? I have the file open to my desktop. I don't need to do any work. I can just, I'm ready to double click on that folder and see what it looks like. If I move this to the icon view, it makes it a little better, right? I'm ready to click on this without anything else. I don't have to say, if I'm on the desktop, I don't have to say go into the desktop. I'm already there, right? I'm already in the desktop. I don't have to say enter the desktop. I'm there to begin with. So I say, great, enter the exercise 1 folder. Great. From there, I need to enter the CSS folder. So I'm going to put a /CSS. From there, I can say the file that I want to look for, the file I want to open to use is style.css. And that gives us a relative path, right? It's a relative. You can tell it's relative because it doesn't have a slash at the beginning. It doesn't tell me where to start my computer from. More commonly, if I was actually, say, working in this index.html file, right, because this is the file that I'm working with, so that's where I'm currently in. I'm currently in this file, and when we're working in a file, files are considered part of the folder themselves. It's kind of another metonymy kind of thing going on. So when I say that I'm in the index.html file, what that really means, right, if I'm working on this file, it really means that I must be inside this exercise 01 Joel Ross folder, right? That's the directory I'm in, because that's where the file is that I'm able to poke at and touch and work with. So from this file, it's the same way of saying from the folder that contains that file, in order to get to the CSS file, so this is going to be, say, starting from index.html, aka the exercise 01 folder. From there, I would say, great, the first thing I need to do is go to CSS. Once I've jumped into the CSS file, then I can find my style.css file. And that's giving me directions on how to find the file, right? That says that from my index.html, that tells me where that file is. Now, to be very clear, I have to give the full directions to get to anywhere, right? If I just said, open up style.css from my index.html file, right? The computer looks at this and it says, I don't see anything called style.css, right? I see an index.html, I see a readme.md, and I see a CSS folder, but that's all I can see. So the computer isn't going to know where to find this file. Even though you're like, well, it's right there, I can see it. Even if you're in this kind of view where you can see it, the computer only knows what's happening inside of its current directory. So in order to move it somewhere else, you'd have to say, go to a different place, right? We have to say, go into the CSS folder, then you can find your style.css file. So this is an example, again, of this relative path. It's giving me directions from my current folder. This is the way that we generally write things in computer programming. Right? Whenever you're doing any kind of programming work, whenever you're trying to give a path to a file, you always want to use a relative path, right? You always want to say, from this folder, from this file that I'm working in, right, from my index.html, how do I get to my CSS? How do I get to the images from here while sort of working within this particular folder? Okay. There's two other things we need to know about this file pathing syntax. And there's a couple other special symbols we use. So this doesn't show up quite as often, but it's worth noting that in writing down a file path, a single dot, a period, means the current directory. So for example, I could say, and you'll see this occasionally, it's not required, but I might say, for example, start in my current directory, right? Be in my current directory, and then from there, enter into my CSS folder. So this / in the beginning doesn't actually mean anything. It basically says like be here and start that work. But it's worth noting that occasionally you'll see a reference to sort of the dot as a directory, and that really just means the current directory. Now, what's more significant and more useful is that if we use 2 dots, if we use 2 periods, that refers to the parent directory, right? That refers to the directory that is above where I currently am. So, for example, if I wrote a file path, here, let's do another quick example. If I did another file path and I said /css/style.css, what that path means is it says, first thing you should do is you should go up a directory. All right, let's do that. So we could say start here, right? I'm currently in my, you know what? Let's do it. Let's do an example. Let's start from the CSS folder. So we'll start from style.css. All right, cool. So we're inside the CSS folder. So we might say, if we want to go find the index.html file, we might say ... go up a directory, right? This is how we're in CSS, so we're going to go up one directory, boom, and then from there, we might say, here's my index.html file. So this ... says how we go up a directory. this can get nested pretty deep, right? So for example, if I want to know how to get back to my desktop from here, right? So that gives me the desktop. If I want to know how to get back to my desktop, I might say start from my CSS folder, right? Starting in here. I might need to say go up a directory. That gives me to here. Then I need to say / go up another directory. That gets me into my desktop. Then I might say, you know what? Let's go into this this project folder that I've created from something, right? Then I might say, great. Now that you're up now that you've gone up 2 directories, go back down the tree to your project directory, and from there go back down the tree into data. And it turns out there's nothing there. But like that's how you can sort of navigate up and down this tree. So if we go back to our tree example, right, the ... says start from your current folder and go up a directory, and you can use ... / ... to sort of move your way up the tree. Oop, sorry, wrong window. Okay. Oh no, this guy there. That's what I want to do. Okay. The parent going up directories is pretty uncommon in web programming at the way that we're building systems. So we're very much going to be designing all of our folder structures, right? We're going to be building up all of our web pages, our project folders, so that our index.html file is in what's called the root of the project. And again, we're using that word root not to mean the root of your computer, which is the thing, right? Not the Macintosh hard drive, not the root of your computer. Also, the C drive is the same thing as the root of your computer, but to mean the root, the sort of the start of this project folder, right? The repo that we're in. And we're never going to go outside of that, so we never need to go up directories. But occasionally we might want to be able to talk about that from, for example, if I made another folder here, right, another folder, and inside that folder I had, if I have like another HTML file in here and I want to refer to how to get back to index.html, I might use the ... to do that. But it's pretty rare. We're not going to do that kind of thing an awful lot. Okay, cool. So that's sort of how we read paths. Is again, we're reading them as each / is separating a folder to go into, where 2 dots means go up a directory folder. Otherwise, it says which folder to go into to do the thing you want to do. Okay, so here's some real world, right? So here's some practical examples of how these file paths end up working together. So most commonly, and this is the kind of thing that you've done in your exercises already, is that we might link to a file that's inside of a CSS folder, where that CSS folder is, again, in the same directory as my index.html, right? So when I say in the CSS folder, I mean that CSS folder has to be in the same, it's a sibling, it's in the same folder as this this HTML file that has this code. So from there, we might say, go into the CSS file, and then from there, go in or open up the style.css file, and that's where you'll find your CSS rules to apply. Similarly, we might say, go into an assets folder, and then inside that assets folder, go into an image folder, because if there's an image folder inside of assets, and then inside that image folder, find the icon.png file, and that's what we can make the icon for our page. Slightly less complicated. We're not going to do this, but we might, as an example, I had to include an example. We might say, like, for example, start your index.html file. We might say, go up a directory, then go into a JS folder, which stands for JavaScript, and then find a script.js file, and that's a thing we could include as a script. We're not going to do this for a couple of weeks. Don't worry about this for a while, but sure, as an example. In general, don't do this, right? Don't use this ... to go up somewhere else. All your files should be in your project folder, so from your index.html, you should never be going up a directory, because that will take you out of the project. And once you've left the project, then those files outside the project will never get uploaded to GitHub. They'll never get published. They're not part of your web page, right? The things that are in your web page is everything only that's inside of your project directory. Okay. The one place we will use absolute paths is if we're linking to an absolute path on the internet. So, for example, I could link to a .css file. This is an example of what's called the Bootstrap CSS file. We'll talk about this later. But I can link to that CSS file by going and finding its absolute URL, right? The thing that starts with HTTPS, right? And this is literally a file that exists on the web, right? I can go ahead and put in this. Oop, not you. That was not what I copied. I want to copy this, please. Thank you. There we go. Right, and that takes me to a file, except that my URL is wrong because I was trying to make it fit on the slide. But literally, that's taking me to a file, and then I'm getting an error that says I can't find the file. But so that's, again, how the one place we might use an absolute path is refer to an absolute location on the internet. It is possible to specify an absolute path location on your computer, right? This says start in my C drive, then go to my users folder, then go to Joel Ross, then go to my style sheets, then go to the LIS 549 style. Do not ever do this, right? Do not ever include anything that has a C colon in your web code. Don't include anything that has your username in your web code. The reason we don't do that is because as soon as we upload this stuff to GitHub, GitHub doesn't have a C drive. GitHub doesn't have a Joel Ross folder. GitHub will never be able to find this file. Anytime I've published this page, this file is never going to get uploaded to GitHub. It's never going to get published. It's never going to get seen by anyone else. So do not do this, right? This is an example of what not to do, but it's an example of what you might see an absolute path looking like. If you ever find yourself writing C:/, it's an absolute path. Don't do that. Always use a relative path. If you find yourself writing a slash at the beginning of a path, right, where you've just got a, like, so you, for example, you put /assets by accident, that's an absolute path. Don't do that, right? All of our file paths are not going to start with any slashes at the beginning. Okay, this is really, really important. I've got a giant blue slide about this. Always use relative paths. One of the biggest bugs that people have when they're first starting out and getting used to writing some CSS and linking into their HTML is that they start writing an absolute path so that the computer can't find what happened, find the file they're looking for, particularly when they publish it onto the web and put it somewhere else. So always use a relative path. It'll make everything work better. It's the correct way of writing code so that it works on other people's computers, so it works, including on GitHub's computers. That's the way to put these things together. Okay. All right, so a couple more file path examples. These are examples with hyperlinks, with anchors, elements. So for example, I could include an href to link to another file called other.html, which would suggest linking to a different HTML file in the same folder. So if I was in this folder here, let me open it up. Oh my gosh, come on. Grab it, there we go. Let me open it up in VS Code real fast. So for example, if I opened up made a new file and I saved it as other.html, right? So I now have two files. I've got an index.html and other.html. If I want index.html to link to other, I would just put a path, right? I don't need to say go into another folder. I need to say go into the exercise folder because I'm already there, right? Index.html is already here. It says, what file do you want me to click on? Click on other.html. Great, we're done. Way to go. It's also possible that you might have HTML files in other folders, maybe to help, if you've got lots of different pages, maybe you want to organize them in different ways. In this case, you might include a hyperlink to something like blog, where you've got a post inside your blog, your post.html file, and that's going to go then to a different file inside of a different directory, but still inside the project folder, right? We're not leaving the project folder, we're staying inside of there. We just have files, we have folders that have these things in other places. This would be the kind of thing that if I made, for example, a blog folder, and I put my other thing inside of it, this is how I would link to my other if it was inside this blog folder. And this is basically what's happening when you do stuff like look at the URLs here, right? This is sort of like saying, and it's not totally like this, because again, it's not doing exactly this, but this is basically saying, go into the Joel Ross folder, and inside that, you can find the LIS 549 file paths file for us to look at, or folder for us to pull some data from. Okay. You might use absolute paths for hyperlinks, particularly if you're linking to another web page on the internet. So for example, this is going to link to the index.html file that's found on a different domain. So it's an entirely different URL. But again, notice that we're putting in a schema. That schema is what makes an absolute path. And then index ischool.uw, which is the domain, and then the path of the file itself. You'll notice what I did not do is I did not put a slash in front of other, or a slash in front of blog here. That would make them absolute paths, which we generally don't want to do. The reason we don't want to do that is in part because if you open up, if you look at, for example, one of your GitHub pages, or on GitHub pages, right? So if we were looking at LIS 549-Sp21 .github.io/problem01, or no, excuse me, exercise 01 Joel Ross, W. Ross, right? That's where I publish my page to. The index.html file is inside of this exercise 01 Joel Ross folder. So if I put an absolute path, it's going to mean absolute relative to the computer itself, right? To the LIS 549 Sp21 github.io computer. So if you put an absolute path here, right? If we just put /index, then what that's really telling it to do is to go to this URL, and that URL doesn't exist, right? This guy does exist, or no, doesn't exist, because I didn't actually, I thought I published the page. Maybe I didn't actually publish it. Should have worked. Okay. But like that's what that would work. But again, we don't the slash is the wrong thing to do. Don't worry about that. I'll fix that later. Okay. Cool. The other thing you can do is what's called a bookmark link. And so what a bookmark link is going to use this fragment aspect. So that's going to be used part of this, going back to my URL format, right? This is using this fragment thing that happens at the end here where I put a hash symbol and then the name of a fragment to jump to. How that works in HTML is that'll actually let you create a hyperlink to a different part of your document. So that's actually going to go to a different part of the same HTML file without loading a different page. In this case, the way it's going to work, nope, this is wrong. Well, let me fix it. Fix slides. Okay, what this is going to do is that it's going to jump to a bookmark or to a fragment, right? It's using the hashtag symbol to do that, and it's saying it's jumping to a symbol. It's the hashtag there. What that means is it's going to then jump to. It's going to link to any particular element in the page that has that ID. So you'll notice that I have a div a little bit further down whose ID is there. So therefore, this link is going to jump to the element with ID. That's what that means, just like in CSS, of there, right? Jump to that element with that ID of there. Cool. And that's how we code these things up. To give you an example of this actually sort of going in action, rather than trying to publish another fake page with a bunch of links in it to make this work, I'm going to actually show you a real example from the 340 course stacks I've been using. Great. So here's a code repo, right? And this is literally, and you notice there's a whole bunch of .html files here. This is a GitHub repository. This is the whole book. And also the web page that people look at, right? If you go to info340.github.io, right? When you go to this web page, this is the source code from it. You can sort of see how that works. So, for example, there's my index.html file. That index.html file is the client-side web development title. Client-side web development, right? That's the page. That's this page that gets opened up and loaded. Okay, so things we might look at, right? Client-side development.html is the name of the first chapter, right? If I click on this chapter, it takes me and opens up that web page, client-side development.html. If I click on HTML fundamentals, it opens up a different HTML file. And literally, we're just going through and linking between these things, between these two different files, right? Client-side development and HTML fundamentals coming from my index.html file, right? We've created hyperlinks between them. If we actually look at this page, I think this will work okay. This thing is super messy because it's all auto-generated from all kinds of other stuff, so ignore that. Okay, here we go. Wait for it. This is the navigation, right? You'll notice there's a whole bunch of LI elements, right, and a whole bunch of AM elements. But here we go. So here's the link, right? Anchor href to HTML fundamentals.html, right? That's the hyperlink that I clicked that took me to a different web page. You'll notice it's a relative path to this other file. Okay, cool. Great. So that's an example. I can use an example of a file path to a file in a directory. So you'll notice in my code directory here, I have an image folder, and in my image folder there's a whole bunch of stuff. But there's also one of these things is the busy spider icon.png. So if I say, let's go to my web page, the root of my computer, right? The root of my computer is this info340.github.io. That's the root of effectively the server that's providing this web page. That's the root of that project. From there, I might say go into the image folder, and from there, I might go to the busy spider icon.png. And when I say go to that URL, it takes me to the very busy spider as an icon, PNG. Right, that's taking me to the element that I want to refer to. Cool. You'll notice if we go back to, so that's kind of fun. That's kind of fun. I think it's kind of fun. If we go back to my index.html file, and then we're going to look at this mess, this horrible, horrible mess. If we get down to where'd it go? There it goes. Right here, you see the end of the head? There's the end of my head. Right before that, 2 lines beforehand, there's my link, right? There's my style sheet that I'm loading up. There's a bunch of other things getting loaded as well. Ignore all the stuff at the top, right? We're just going to look right here at the bottom. This link style sheet, this relative style sheet, right? Or style sheet relation, right? We're loading a file that's css/style.css, right? That's where we're going to go find the file that we want to load. Well, we can then do that, right? That says from my index.html, go into the CSS folder, and there's the style.css file that we want to load, right? So that's a practical, real-world example, right? Real world, right? This is literally the web page that we're showing to. Hold on, nope, not you. This one, right? This is literally the web page that we're reading the book from. And it's using these relative paths to say, here's how I can find that CSS file inside of that CSS folder, etc. You'll notice that if we again look at these, there's other things, for example, there's also this libs thing that's got other stuff. There's a bunch of different nested folders here that we can use relative paths to get to when we need to do that. Okay, but again, that's going to give us sort of the structure that we need to be able to let us refer to files that are in different folders that are inside of our repository. Notice there's no ... here, right? Everything is inside of this code repository because everything I want to get uploaded has to get pushed to GitHub Pages and uploaded through that repository to make it work. Okay, and I think that's all the examples that I have. So that's the basic idea. So again, the main takeaways: the slash is a way of dividing folders, and we say go into a folder by putting a slash. So this says start from my server. Slash means go into the img folder, and from there go into the busyspidericon.png. That's where you find that file. So when we're giving the directions, the path to say how to get to a particular file, think about what folder am I starting in, right? What folder is the file that I'm working on currently in? And then what folders it has to go into in order to get to the file that I want to refer to, the style sheet, the image, or the whatever. And again, the way we're going to do that is you're going to start by just writing, you're not going to put a slash in front, you're not going to put a C colon in front, you're just going to say, from here, specify what file to go into, specify which file to go to find. And that's where you're done. And that's everything, and that's your it. It's done. Okay, great. And that's the basic idea behind file paths and how you're going to use them on the internet.